exams are passed back. Class average is lower than my classes last year. Last year was an 80%. This year's a 75%. But I'm not altogether too surprised. Last year we had some labs that kind of reiterated some of the lecture material. You had more practice with mitosis and meiosis. But you have many opportunities for points back on this one. All right, so there are many questions that a lot of you just altogether missed. And it's actually very informative on my end, knowing that without that lab coupling, that next year I think I need to do something different with lecture to make sure we get this material. But many opportunities for points back. This is posted on Moodle under Unit 3. If you're looking for it on Moodle, same format, right? These test corrections, I put it due on the Moodle page. I believe they're due on Friday. I could be wrong. If you download the document on Moodle, it has the date. I forgot to put the date on here. Let's see. In general, many of the questions that were missed were very similar across everybody's exams, right? Any questions you have before I move on? All right, I still have a little bit of housekeeping. So my next slide here, so we're 2 weeks out from the final, right? So 2 weeks from today is the final exam on the last day of class. So I hope you're thinking about it, right? That exam is semi-cumulative. There we go. Which means most of the exam questions will be on the unit we're covering now. Right, so 45 points will be on the Unit 4 material. But it's out of 65, so that means 20 points is on cumulative material. Right? So what I have done to kind of help you with the stress of a final, help you consolidate where you need to be putting your studying efforts, is I have posted some semi-cumulative questions up on Moodle. Right? All of the cumulative material items on the final exam will come from these questions. I believe there's 8 different questions. Right? So I'm giving you the questions ahead of time. They will either show up exactly as I have written them on the form I post on Moodle here, or as a series of short answers. Right? Similar to how I might break down a concept in a normal exam, ask you a series of short answers rather than one large essay. Because I'm giving you the questions ahead of time, I would expect full comprehension, and I will be kind of picky when it comes to those questions, right? But you do have 2 whole weeks to go through them, and it's only 8 questions. So hopefully that helps a little bit, eases your mind. As a reminder, I have built into this course an opportunity to have me grade a missed assignment. All right, so I know some of you have taken the opportunity and advantage of this opportunity. Other of you, maybe you forgot about it, right? But if you have an assignment that I've already graded, right? I have not yet graded Content Check 8 or the eugenics assignment. But all the other assignments, maybe you missed a scientific literacy assignment. That's 10 points. That's a good chunk of points. And you want to do it late, submit it. You would fill out this form so I would know to go back in and grade it for you. All right, now this is something that can only be used once, so if you've already done it, great, you've taken advantage of this opportunity. If not, pick out the correct document you want me to grade. I would suggest the document with the highest points associated with it. But I just put this up here as a reminder that this is an opportunity for you to use in this class. Any questions about final exam, missed assignments? All right. As a reminder, our final exam is on the last day of class. Right? Some of your other classes might have it on finals day, but we took a vote at the beginning of the semester, and the majority of you said last day of class, so that's what we are going with. All right, so we are going to finish up a lecture that we started a week ago, last Monday before break. So to kind of reorient yourself, right, Last Monday we talked about Darwin and his voyage and how he came up with the theory of evolution. Right? We left off talking about a little bit about natural selection, right? But we stopped before we started talking about evidence for evolution, right? And that's where we're going to pick up today. So we're going to talk about these 5 pieces of evidence for evolution, right? And I will go into each of them in a little bit more detail here. And we're going to start with paleontology, right? So paleontology, we are looking at the fossil record, right? So we're looking at the fossil record and where it's located in different rock layers, right? So sedimentary rock, right? They're formed on top of each other, right? The older layers are typically towards the bottom. The newer layers are typically towards the top. Now, there's variation in that in geology that we're not going to go into. But if we think about the older layers, right, they're going to have fossils that are older, right? If they were formed longer ago, the fossils that were formed in those layers are also much older. Versus younger rock layers that weren't formed as long ago, they're relatively newer, right? They're going to have younger fossils in them, right? So we can look at how old a rock layer is and get an idea as to how old the fossil is that is in that layer. Right? If we know that layer is old, we know that the fossil is an older fossil. If we know that that rock layer is young, we know that that fossil is younger. Right? And those different rock layers we often call strata, right? Different layers. And they can be dated using a variety of mechanisms. And based on what we date those rock layers, we can also date the fossils found in them. All right, so this is one way that we can use paleontology, or the fossil record, to provide evidence for evolution. Right? And the older we go, the less complex we see the animals, whereas the younger layers, we see more complex animals, more complex organisms starting to arise. Now, this is not the only way that we can use paleontology. We can also use it to look at fossils that we would call transitional species. So these are fossils that link extinct species with species that are living today. Really good example of this is a fossil that scientists have labeled in the genus Tiktaalik, right? So it says Tiktaalik rosei, right? It's a fossil that's not quite a fish, not quite an amphibian, right? It has features of both, which is what makes it a transitional species, right? So it has features of an amphibian. It has eyes on the top of the head, right? It has a flat head, it has a neck, it has ribs. Right? These are all typical of an amphibian. But it also has features that look like a fish, right? It has scales, it has fins, right? It has this tail that looks like it should be swimming in water, right? So it has features of both of these different types of organisms. Right? Now there's many examples of transitional species. This is just one of the more famous examples. Right? So it doesn't look like a fish, doesn't look like an amphibian, it's somewhere in between. So if we're thinking in the evolutionary timeline, right, it evolved probably after a fish evolved, but maybe before the amphibian evolved. It's transitioning into that amphibian era of the timeline. All right, so we have our transitional species. Another piece of evidence for evolution is biogeography. And this is basically just the distribution of animals on the planet, right? We're looking at their geographic distribution. And if they're closer together and they look similar, this suggests that they probably have common ancestry. Right? So for example, we have in California here, on the mainland, we have this gray fox. And on the islands, we have this island fox, right? They're really close geographically. We can assume that somewhere in the past, they had a common ancestor, right? But over time, they evolved to be different, right? Now, because the island fox evolved on islands, right, this is a very classic example of a species being endemic, right? So typically, isolated continents or island groups will have a unique collection of plants or animals that are only found in that area, right? So maybe it's a type of spider that is only found on one island, right? Maybe it's a type of lizard that's only found in one of the islands of the Galapagos, right? They're only found in one area. They are endemic to that location, right? We really see this happening in isolated areas like islands or continents that are really isolated, right? And one mechanism by which this can happen, right, we're talking over periods of time here, we're not talking a few years. If we look at a piece of land that maybe species A is currently inhabiting, right? It's adapted to the environment. This is species A. Now, over time, maybe that piece of land broke into two pieces, right? Maybe a river split this island in half. Now, species A is still going to live in part of that island that's broken up, right? It's still pretty well adapted to that area. But on the other half, right, it might evolve into species B. Maybe the other half of the island had different environmental conditions that caused this species to evolve into species B. Likewise, maybe it split yet again into a third piece, right? Again, we're conserving species A, we're conserving species B, but maybe on this third piece here, right, again, environment might be slightly different. B might evolve into C, right? Now, when we're looking at this, A is endemic to an island, B is endemic to an island, and C is endemic to an island. It's only found on that particular place. All right, another line of evidence for evolution is convergent evolution. And I realized when reviewing these slides that I really should have put this in red and made you fill in the blank here because it's such a key piece of terminology. Right, so convergent evolution is where we have different species, right, from different lineages. So species that are not related at all, but they share a similar characteristic, right, because of the similar environments that they inhabit. So a good example of this, right, is a shark, an ichthyosaur, and a dolphin. Right? An ichthyosaur is an older lineage of a fish, right? But we have a fish, a reptile, and a mammal, right? They're not related. They have different lineages. They evolved completely separate from one another, but they look very similar. They have similar characteristics, right? They have this body shape for swimming in the water. They have fins to help them swim, right? So the water is the common environment that they are sharing that helps shape their similar characteristics, even though they're not related to one another. Right? These similar characteristics, we can put a piece of terminology to it. We can say that they have analogous features. So these analogous features would be the fins, or would be the body shape between the shark, the ichthyosaur, and the dolphin. If we look at an example of plants, right? These are two different species of plants. One's an English ivy, one is called a winter creeper. They look similar, but they're not related at all, right? But they have common characteristics. And in this case, the common characteristic is that they vine. They create vines to hold on to other structures to help them grow upwards against a tree, right? Or against some other structure. These vines are the analogous features, right? There are similar features between different species that are not at all related. All right, let's step back and do a review. I am not going to attempt to say the name of this dinosaur. But why is this an example of a transitional species between dinosaurs and birds? So I want you to look at it and tell me, what features do you see that are reptilian, so dinosaur-like, and what features are avian, or bird-like? There are test corrections. They're posted on
Yeah, their teeth is also like
still happens. Videotape it. I had to do that on purpose.
Just turn on.
Videotape it. I've had to do that when I've rented another property. I'm like, there's a giant puddle on my front.
Yeah.
I talked to them.
I hate you. No, I actually hate you. You didn't even get this. It's so bad. I'm still gonna play it. Only 5 more days left. I actually I was looking at it all the time. I'm so mad at this. That's what I figured. I'm catching up to you.
I'm not.
What made me take it is like what the hell's going on? Because I knew it far and I knew it all.
It's not
Freaking out during the game before
Trace the dolphin. You just trace
I believe it's Friday.
when he was in
ask me that question and I'll tell you. Ask him.
my sister will be like pretty out. She probably has not had mom. My mom's in
All of this. Let's ask him.
Lots of questions. I like it.
I have a question on.
Yeah.
I didn't do it. But I if not, I could just use my hands. Well, I don't need to waste it. There's nothing else left.
I'm going to grade it. I'm like tomorrow, so. All right, if we're looking at this dinosaur, what features Let's start with the avian features because I think they might be easier. What features look like a bird?
Wings.
They have wings. What else do they have? Feathers, tails. They have some like talon-like things, right? They have claws. What about and a beak? What about reptilian features? Yeah, maybe scales on the face. Maybe the beak has the teeth. Let's see. Lots of vertebrae. Even the claws are more reptilian too, right? There's a lot of different features that look kind of like birds, kind of like amphibians. So this is why we would say, not amphibians, reptilian. This is why we would say this is a transitional species between birds and dinosaurs. In fact, it would kind of be the other way around. It would be dinosaurs transitioning into birds. So if we kind of look at a cartoon image here, right, we would have the dinosaur first, then we would have our transitional species, and then we would have a bird. All right, so this is a very classic example, again, of a transitional species. Any questions? All right, we'll continue on. Some of the evidence for natural selection and evolution is actually through artificial means, right? So we can artificially breed different varieties of dogs or cats or many other different types of plants and animals. Right? The very fact that we could, say, start with a wolf and get a whole variety of dog breeds, right, means that we can artificially select out phenotypes that we like. Right? Now, this is artificial selection. This is humans doing the selecting. Right? But nature does it in the same way, right? It's nature doing the selecting if it's natural selection. It's humans doing the selecting if it's artificial selection. And it all comes back to genetics, right? This is all because there's genetic variation within that species. So the wolf had the genetic variation to have different fur lengths, right, or different body types. Now, we've grossly exaggerated some of those features over time as we as we made these different breeds, right? But the breeders, we are choosing desirable phenotypes, right? So I personally love the look of little wiener dogs. I think their short, stubby legs and long bodies are hilarious, right? So maybe I have decided I like that phenotype. But there's genes, there's alleles that underlie that phenotype. Right? So we're selecting for certain alleles.
So is this what humans, is humans artificial selection?
Not necessarily. Artificial selection typically has a goal. Like, we want to make a dog with short legs and a long body. Versus when humans mate to create children, you're typically not mating with the goal to create a child with a certain hair color or eye color. Right? Now we're getting kind of into the eugenics territory. But rather it's you're mating with somebody because of and we'll talk about this, sexual selection to create an offspring. It's a good question though. Yeah, it's interesting to think about. All right, so natural selection, nature does the choosing. Artificial selection, breeders do the choosing. Darwin had this as an influence as well. All right, so Darwin saw evidence for evolution in artificial selection in his day. Different pigeons were bred for different feather variations and colorations. But even the foods that we eat, right, many vegetables all come from one plant. So wild mustard is the ancestor of vegetables such as Brussels sprouts and cabbage and broccoli. They all descended from one plant. Right? They were artificially bred for specific things, right? Cabbage was bred for this big, leafy, middle part of the plant, right? Versus Brussels sprouts, right? They had these little buds that were bred instead of one large bud, like the cabbage, right? We selected out different features that we liked and wanted more of. All right, the last type of evidence for evolution that we will talk about is homologies. So homologies, right, is different than convergent evolution This is where we see similarities between species because of a common ancestor. So convergent evolution, they did not have a common ancestor. But for homologies, we do have a common ancestor. Okay? And so homologies are similarities between species because of that common ancestor. There's different types of similarities. They can be anatomical, they can be developmental, they can be molecular. We will give examples of each of these here. We're going to start with anatomical. Right, so on this slide and on the next slide, which I'll eventually switch to here, I'll give you time to write down any notes. Right, we'll see that the arm, right, so like the human arm, the whale arm, right, a lizard arm, a hummingbird arm, they're all essentially the same. They have the same components, right? They're just slightly adapted for the different features that these individual species may need. So if we look at this, right, we would say that the arm has homologous structures, a structure that's derived from the common ancestor. Between these species, we see that they all have a humerus. They all have an ulna and phalanges, even though they might be modified for certain reasons, right? So they're modified in the bat to fly. They're modified in the whale to swim, but they all have these similarities. Right, so these homologous sets of bones have evolved into different structures depending on the function in their environment. Right, flying versus swimming versus the arm of the human, right? So these would be homologous structures. All these different similarities. A whale has phalanges, a turtle has phalanges. It just looks a little modified. Now, this isn't the only type of homology we might have that's anatomical. And one of my favorites is talking about vestigial structures. So vestigial structures are anatomical structures that they exist, they're there, but they have absolutely no apparent reason for being there. So in humans, we have this coccyx, right? It's a vestigial tail. It has no apparent reason for being there, right? Why do we need bones for a little tail, right? There's no apparent reason for it. But we think it exists because it's a remnant of our ancestry, right? Of our ancestry of developing off of the evolution of primates. Same for, say, the boa constrictor, right? Boa constrictor in their skeletal remains still has remnants of a hip bone and hind legs. Well, this is a snake, right? It doesn't have hind legs. It doesn't need a hip. So why are they there? There's no apparent reason for it, other than we think maybe their ancestor did have a hip, did have hind legs, right? And these features just persisted. Same for a manatee, right? Manatees, they have fingernails on their flippers. Why do they have fingernails? We don't know. We presume it's because their ancestor also had fingernails somewhere back in their ancestry line. Right, so these would be vestigial structures, a type of anatomical homology. All right, there's also developmental homologies. So this is where species, we might look completely different from each other when we're adults or when we are born, right? So house cat, a human, a chicken, we all look completely different. But in the embryonic stage, right, as an embryo, we have common features. And these would be developmental homologies. So for example, right, humans, we have gill ridges when we are embryos, which indicates that maybe humans evolved from an ancient line that had an animal with gill slits, right? Same with chickens, same with house cats, right? We all evolved somehow from an animal that had gill slits, and we are seeing this as an embryo. Now, obviously, we don't have gills when we are born, they go away, right? But in this developmental stage, we do see them. Same with the tails, right? Human embryos, we have long bony tails. So do chickens, so do cats, right? Cats obviously preserve this feature when they're born, but humans do not, right? But in the developmental stage, we all look very similar. So that would be developmental homologies, right? Homologies that are, you can see them when we're embryos, but not when we are born, not when we are adult organisms. The last homology that we will talk about is not one that Darwin saw, but rather as science has advanced, we have come to recognize. And those are genetic homologies, right? So these are relationships between our DNA, between different species, right? So if we look at, say, this hemoglobin beta chain here, right? And we're going to look at the similarities in the amino acids present in this protein. So our human is going to be our control. Right, our human, we say we have 146 amino acids that are similar among humans. If we compare a human to a rhesus monkey, we see that there's still some similarities. We have maybe 138 similarities and a few differences. But we could also compare a human to a fish, right? And there's still some similarities, although fewer of them. There's 21 amino acids that are the same. It's still the same protein, still has the same function, right? But there's differences and similarities. Now what this tells us, right, is that all life forms are related, right? We all have DNA. We have very similar genetic codes, especially in particular proteins, right? And that these life forms, they share the DNA code, and the closer they're related, right, the more that they share. So we are more closely related to the rhesus monkey than the fish, right? Which makes sense why we have more similarities with the monkey rather than with the fish. In fact, humans and bacteria also share some common genetic similarities. Now, humans and bacteria, we're so vastly different from each other, right? We are not related very closely at all. We have the most distant ancestor basically possible. But there's still some similarities in our genetic code that we can see between bacteria and humans. And another example on this slide is in humans and the fruit fly, right, having to do with something with vision, right? The amino acid sequence is 90% similar between the two, right? That would be a genetic homology. A genetic similarity due to a common ancestor. All right, we talked about a lot of similarities. So I want you to review what are the 3 types of homologies. And then I want you to find an example of it that's different from what we talked about in class. And I will ask you to share those examples.
Till the next break, I'm like, yeah, so I read I'm really jealous of those, like my sisters for just going home December 9th. No. We only started like 2 days earlier.
Doesn't matter.
What are we finding for homologies?
Ask
Interesting. I imagine I picked out the most common ones. I think I based this off of textbook we used. So,
Yeah. I mean.
all right. What is one type of homology? Anatomical. Yes. Did we find any examples of anatomical homologies? Ah, there we go. Yes. So that's a homology. It's not necessarily between species, though. That's more between sexes, right? Anybody find anything else?
We have fingers like monkeys.
Yeah, fingers. Talking about the anatomical homologies. We all have phalanges. I think there's also an anatomical homology about ears in mammals. We all have like similar characteristics of ears. All right, what's our next type of homology? Developmental. Did anybody find an example of a developmental homology? I wouldn't blame you if you did. This one's probably the hardest one. Yeah, like we talked about gills and tail. Yeah. Those are the most common ones. This is a little bit harder to find. What about genetic homologies? Right? Did we find any examples of a genetic homology? It shouldn't be too hard to find.
I'll tell you.
Did anybody find the one about bananas in humans?
I told you.
I feel like that statistic always comes up in this class, something about between humans and bananas we're X% related to one another in our genetic code. Did I hear 65%? Yeah. Yeah. So there's a lot of genetic homologies. Yeah. Any questions about homologies before we move on?
I'm so lost.
So homologies are just similarities between different species that all have a common ancestor.
According to scientific understanding, humans are considered to be around 50% genetically similar to monkeys.
50%. There we go. Similar genetic code. Now we're very distantly related to bananas, which means we don't have too much in common, but genetic code is preserved. All right. Any other questions before we move on to our next topic? All right, we're going to continue then. So, last Monday and then today, right, we talked about evolution, which is the change in allele frequency in a population over time, right? So we have our phenotype, what we're physically seeing. We have our genotype that underlies the phenotype, right? We presented some evidence for evolution, and we briefly talked about one of the mechanisms for evolution, which is natural selection. We're going to expand upon that mechanism today, and then on Wednesday talk about other mechanisms. All right, to kind of jog your memory here, right? So we're starting with natural selection. On Wednesday, we'll talk about genetic drift and gene flow and mutation. But natural selection. Right, remember we talked about this, we use this image with our snails here. It's differential survival and reproduction. Some individuals are just going to do better than others. But 4 criteria have to be met. Right, so as a review, one of that criteria is more offspring produced that can survive. Right, so we're producing a lot of offspring, some of them are not going to survive. Right, but we're producing enough offspring to make sure that population persists. There is variation within the population. So in our snail example, we had 2 different colors of shells. That variation has some sort of fitness advantage or disadvantage, right? So there's fitness differences, meaning that for one color, maybe they are going to produce more offspring that can survive than the other color, right? So fitness is offspring that survive, that them themselves can make offspring. Right? If all of the light-colored shells are taken out, right, they have a lower fitness because they are not able to produce offspring. And finally, that variation is heritable. We can pass along the trait for, in this case, shell color from parent to offspring. All right, so this should all be review. We talked about this last Monday, right, just to kind of orient ourselves on natural selection. Big picture, the environment is doing the selecting. All right, and the environment can do the selecting in different ways. Right? It might be the predators in the environment doing the selecting. In this case, we have some blue jays eating some moths. Those moths are nice and bright against the tree. They're easy to detect. All right, so maybe that's a disadvantage in that phenotype, having a lighter moth. Right? Predators might be doing the selecting. Diseases in the environment might be doing the selecting. So the Tasmanian devil population, right, is currently being decimated by a disease in the environment. Right, so they're doing this, the disease is doing the selecting. It might be competition, right? So competition for resources, for water, for food, for mates, right? That might be doing selecting in the environment, competing for that resource. A common resource that's often competed for is food, right? So in this case, there's a certain amount of flowers in a field, but all the insects need to eat, right? So those insects are competing for flowers, competing for pollen, right? Competing for that limited food source. So the environment is doing the selecting, and it's the phenotype that's being selected, not the genotype, right? Nature could care less about what alleles you have, what genetic code you have. It only cares about what is being presented to it, right? So it doesn't care if you are heterozygous, right? It only cares that you have light fur or dark fur. All right, natural selection, right? The goal of natural selection is that there is no goal, all right? Natural selection does not aim to make perfect organisms. So selection, it can only exist on variation that's already there, right? So if we have a population of beavers and one has brown fur, one has white fur, right? Natural selection cannot act upon beavers that have blue fur because it literally doesn't exist, right? So that plays into this next one, that evolution is limited by historical constraints. It's limited by what they have evolved, right? So if beavers never evolved the trait for blue fur, natural selection cannot act upon it, right? Often these adaptations are compromises, right? They're not the most ideal thing for the organism. So we don't see, right, this beaver having a chainsaw for a hand, right? Obviously, that would be the most ideal to take trees down, right? But instead, it's a compromise, right? A good example of this would be birds in the tropics, right? They have wings, right? They also have this really bright patch on their throat. They both help to attract mates. So these birds will do a very elaborate mating dance, right? The bigger the feathers, the bigger the wings, the better they are at attracting a mate. Great. But bigger wings means it's harder for them to fly. So it's a trade-off. It's a compromise. And then finally, the changes often happen unpredictably, right? We cannot predict what is going to happen in a population. It's a combination of chance, natural selection, and just interactions within the environment, right? We could not predict that this certain species of birds would have the larger wings, right? So natural selection, we're not making perfect organisms. All right, I want to do kind of a fun class review here. So I want us to go to this link, right? If you have a computer or work with somebody next to you that has a computer, when you click on this link, it'll give you two options. I want you to click on the lab option. And it's going to simulate natural selection. I want you to add a mate, then add a fur mutation, wait a few generations, and then add in wolves. And then I want you to tell me, how does fur color influence the survival of these rabbits? And then what if those rabbits were in a different environment? All right, I'll give you about 3 minutes here. I'm going to leave this up, and then eventually I will switch over to the simulation as well. Just at least a couple. Enough so you have enough variation in the population. So I'm going to go.
Which ones die first? It's the white ones. Oh my gosh. That's why you want them to be brown. If they're not brown, they'll die. Now the white ones are going to be more. Are you gonna have that food?
Every time.
Yeah.
It's the camouflage.
All right, what are we finding about the fur color of the rabbits? Brown survives when we added wolves. Why? Yeah, they can blend into their environment, right? What would happen if we were to make that environment snowy, for example? The white would likely survive. Now, I switched the environment too late, in that I only had the brown bunnies, and I did not have the white allele anymore, I think I actually had too many bunnies. So we'll start it over. We'll start with this population. I'll speed it up here. We'll add a mate. We have the mutation of the fur color. We'll let that produce a little bit, and now add in some wolves. We see that they're selecting for the ones that they can find easier, right? Those lighter colored rabbits. But if we change the environment, and we still have wolves, yeah, we do see that. The white ones are now tending to survive more because of the environment that they are in. Now, I like this simulation. You could play around with a whole bunch of different features here. So if we were to, say, do different teeth, right? So some have long teeth, some have short teeth, right? We'll let that generation persist a little bit here. I'm going to look at the proportions of the rabbits here, right? So the dark purple has the short teeth, the lighter hatched variation has the long teeth. If I were to say, give them a food source that's very tough, very hard to chew, right? What would happen to this generation over time, right? So let's see how those alleles are changing. And we see, we can't physically see it as well in the simulation, but we see that now they mostly have long teeth because those are the ones that can actually eat that food source, right? It's a very interesting simulation. I encourage you to play around with it a little bit here. Any questions regarding the simulation? All right. So in terms of natural selection, there's different patterns that can occur, right? And so when natural selection happens, we can see a few different patterns emerging, and we're going to break down each of these 4 patterns here. We're going to start with directional selection. So if we start with directional selection, right? The starting population in our graph here, it has the dotted lines. And we see that the population has shifted so that only an extreme phenotype is favored, right? So not all the phenotypes are favored, but one extreme is favored. And so an example of this might be in populations of mice, right? A population of mice, they might be mostly light colored. However, maybe a new allele has been introduced, right? Maybe a mouse migrated into this population. Or maybe a mutation occurred that caused one mouse to have darker fur. Over time, over many generations, we might see that that population is going to change to have predominantly darker furred mice, right? It's favoring one of those extremes. It's not favoring the lighter colored extreme. It's not favoring an intermediate of like a whiter brown, right? Which you don't even see in this population. But it's favoring the extreme of having darker fur, right? It's shifting towards having a darker furred population. So we see that our starting population and our population after many generations has shifted towards a direction, right? Shifted towards a direction of one of those extremes, and in this case, the dark fur is that extreme that is favored. Right? So again, this is happening over many generations. So we can shift to favor one extreme. We might have a pattern that doesn't favor extremes. Right? Maybe it doesn't favor an extreme, but rather it favors the middle phenotype. Right? So it doesn't favor the extreme on one end or the extreme on the other end, but favors an intermediate phenotype. Right? So the extreme traits are selected against. So an example of this is clutch size in birds. Right? If birds, they can produce different variety or different numbers of eggs. Right? If they produce too many eggs, that's not great because they're not going to be able to care and feed for all of those chicks when they hatch or all of those young birds. Right? However, if they produce too few eggs, right, now they're not going to produce enough offspring to sustain their population. Right? So instead, what's favored is having an intermediate amount of eggs. Right? So we see the starting population has a wide variety from few to many eggs, but after many generations, we see that the number of eggs kind of in the middle is favored. So not too few, not too many. So this would be stabilizing selection, right? We're stabilizing for that intermediate. Our next pattern is that maybe we don't want the intermediate, and maybe we don't want just one extreme. Maybe we want both extremes. So we might start off with a population, again, that has a variety of phenotypes, and end with a population that doesn't have the intermediate phenotype. So an example of this are types of grasses that grow in contaminated soils. We often see this out west where there's a lot of mining activity and a lot of heavy metals might be introduced to the soil. There might be plants out there that are resistant to those heavy metals, and there might be plants that are very sensitive to those heavy metals. So in a population, right, maybe we started with a population, some were metal sensitive, many were metal sensitive, and many were metal resistant, right? So those that were metal sensitive, they still persisted on the areas that did not have contamination, but those that were resistant were able to survive on the soils that did have contamination. But those in the middle didn't do so well. It was an either or situation, right? Either you were resistant or you were not resistant. All right, so this is what is known as disruptive selection. Other textbooks, other sites might call it diversifying selection. Means the same thing. We're favoring both of the extremes. We do not want the middle. All right, our last pattern that we'll talk about is balancing selection. This is where nothing really changes. It kind of stays the same, right? So the alleles in a population are kept in balance with one another. We are not favoring an extreme. We're not favoring an intermediate, right? All of the alleles are present. A good example of this would be in human populations that live in areas where malaria is common, right? Where malaria is common, we typically have what's called the heterozygote advantage of having an allele for sickle cell disease. Now, sickle cell disease is a recessive allele, right? So it's only going to lead to the disease if you have two recessive alleles. So what we're finding is that if you have two recessive alleles, right, you have sickle cell disease. Not great. However, if you have just one sickle cell allele and the other is normal, you don't have the disease. The disease is masked by the dominant allele, but you actually have a better resistance against malaria, right? So these individuals that are heterozygous have better resistance to malaria versus maybe individuals that are homozygous dominant. They have both dominant alleles, right? They don't have sickle cell disease, great, but they're more susceptible to malaria. So we see that the heterozygote in this case has the advantage for this particular environment. All right, let's do a quick group review here, and this might be our last slide. So I want you to tell me in these images, right, what pattern is emerging for selection? All right, let's look at the first graph. We're looking at body size in birds. And we see there's a shift to having a larger body size. What type of pattern is emerging? Yeah, directional selection. It's shifting towards one phenotype, one of the extreme phenotypes, having a larger body size. All right, what about birth weight in babies? Right, we see that we are favoring the intermediate. What type of selection is this? Stabilizing. Yes. I like interpreting these graphs. I like grading interpreting these graphs. So it's highly likely that this might show up on a final exam, is knowing how to interpret these graphs. All right. We will pick up on Wednesday with our last bit of natural selection, which is sexual selection.